First off, Arcane Subtraction. 1 and a white for a instant. Target creature gets -4 and 0 until end of turn, and you learn. Yet again, this one's pretty decent for limited, I would say. Maybe in standard, but like I said, again, I think like with learn spells, you really want to have them cheap. So that if you need to cast a lesson on the same turn, you would rather do that. And 2 mana is like close. Like, I still prefer the 1 mana learn spells, but if you're playing like a tempo list, it's actually pretty decent. So I'll give it like a. I'm gonna give it like a C minus. It's decent, but it's nothing to write home about. But -4, semi draw card, rummage, very nice. Next up, the Archmage Emeritus. 4 mana for a 2/2 that has Magecraft. Whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, draw a card. Ooh. Now, I know a lot of people are probably going to be questioning why this is 4 mana for a 2/2. Don't underestimate it, because the Magecraft ability on this is insane. Like, the fact that that essentially makes any of your spells that you play just be like, do the spell's effect, and then draw a card, that's a very powerful ability. Like, let's say, for example, you Shatter the Sky, and you draw a card. If you even will draw a second card if you meet the Shatter the Sky limit of having a creature power 4 or less, or 4 or more, essentially. Or, like, let's say, for example, you just, like, Blood Cheese first something. It's like, destroy this, and then draw a card. Like, I can go through all the spells that being able to just attach on it at the end, draw a card thanks to Archmage Emeritus, is very, 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 very silly. Plus, also keep in mind you can get multiple copies of this on the battlefield, which then makes you can draw multiple cards. Like, there's some silly storm-based shenanigans if you want to, like, draw your entire deck that you could probably do with Archmage Emeritus. However, it is still 4 mana. 4 mana is a lot, especially for a 2/2 that can die to some of the more popular removal in the format. So it's definitely a card that I think it's going to see its play in Commander, because in Commander this is insane. In Standard, it has a chance, but I kind of doubt it. I'm still going to be optimistic and like give this a very high B+, because this card is Magecraft. Draw a card, do not underestimate. And the fact that it works on copies too, especially since there's a lot of spells that allows us to copy spells, like this is going to be a Commander. Like, for any Izzet Spellslinger deck, they are going to play this card like that. So yeah, B+. This card's pretty good. I don't know if it's going to see standard play, but in Commander, watch out. Next up, we got the Burrog Befuddler. It is a 1 and a blue for a frog wizard. With flash, it's a 2/1. And it has, when it enters the battlefield, target creature and opponent control gets -1 attack until end of turn. First of all, the fact that we have a frog wizard in this set is really cute and adorable. I'm just going to say that right off the bat. As for the card itself, it's a fine limited card, with even some budget fringe applications in standard at the very least, because the factor is these type of effects of having a creature that can enter in with flash and then give your opponent's creature -1 reduction helps us with combat-based shenanigans. That's very nice. We even still have flash-based tribal shenanigans in standard at the moment, so I mean, it has a chance, but I think there are better flash creatures in the format still. But I think this is mostly going to see its play in limited, and in maybe some like gimmicky, like I want to play a frog tribal list or some shtick like that. But besides that, it's like a C minus. Yeah, it's like a C minus. It's on average. It's a good card, but it's not like, I don't think it's going to see much play in Eternal formats or in Standard in general. Next up, let's bury ourselves in the books. 4 and a blue for an instant. The spell costs 2 less to cast if it targets a attacking creature. And it has put target creature into its owner's library second from top. Overall, great limited card. Like, this is going to be a card that I will snap pick in limited. Just being able to tempo your opponent's creature to put it from the second from top, that's a very powerful limited ability. Don't underestimate that. This card is actually good as like a 1 over 2 of Unlimited, just because of the tempo advantage you get from that. And the fact that you get the spell reduction if the target you're attacking is attacking, which then makes this a free mana spell at instant speed that does this effect. Very powerful, don't underrate it. I give it like for limited, like a high B. Like even to maybe even like a B plus. In standard though, it's not bad, but yet again, there's better, cheaper removal in the formats. I mean, maybe if you want the tempo play, if you're playing like, I don't know, would you play this in Rogues? Because then you can put the second from top, you mill your opponent's cards so they don't draw it. Maybe, but mostly when people want to play spells like that, they prefer ones that cost like 2 mana that still cost free. So yeah, limited All-Star, but probably not much play outside of that format. Next up, Curate. 1 and a blue for a instant. Look at the top 2 cards of your library. Put any number of them into your graveyard and the rest back on your library in any order, and then you draw a card. Overall, pretty good. Surveil on a instant, very, very nice. Now, there's better card draw formats in the format, but this is pretty cheap. We do want to keep an eye on cheap spells, especially with Magecraft being a mechanic. And just being able to essentially just, if you need to, just mill 2 cards to just draw a card. Or just essentially just like scry your library, semi-scry in a sense, to just get to what you need to, and then draw the card you need, and then draw into the second card. It's a very versatile draw spell, essentially. Surveil is a very powerful effect. We've seen that when Guilds was in Standard and such. Surveil is very powerful. So Surveil 2 on an instant that costs 2 mana, pretty good. But I'm not like going to overhype it. This is still like a C card, maybe even a C+, but still a good card. Next up, Divide by 0. 2 and a blue for an instant. Return target spell or permanent with mana value 1 or greater to its owner's hand, and you learn. So, okay, thing to keep in mind, you can't use this to return tokens. But you can return about almost everything else to your opponent's hand at instant speed, and then you semi-draw a card with learn. Pretty good. Like, this is a pretty good card. The only catch-22 is, I'm not sure if it's going to be that amazing in limited. I think it's going to be decent in limited. Mostly because the factor is we have been seeing from all the tribes and all the mechanic archetypes, there's a lot of token generation. So the fact that you can't remove tokens from this is a very costly effect, since a lot of token generation seems like to be in the set. You gotta keep that in mind. But being able to return your opponent's most problematic thing, and then maybe semi-draw either whether tutoring from the sideboard or from just the rummage effect to get an answer to that permanent, whether it's a counter spell or a potential removal spell, that's nothing to underestimate. So, pretty much 2 free mana to bounce something and hopefully tutor for the answer to what you're bouncing. That's very powerful. That's like a B- card. That's pretty good. B-. Next up, the Dream Strits. Spirit Owl! It is a bird illusion, though. It is a free 2. It has, when it becomes a target of a spell, it must be sacrificed. But when it dies, you learn. Overall, really good card. Just a free mana, free 2 flyer. That's really decent. And the factor is, it has a really neat effect that it's kind of a nice counter to adventure spells, essentially. Because let's say your opponent tries to stop this. It fizzles automatically. When it fizzles, then the adventure part of the spell doesn't resolve, which then puts Bone Crusher in the graveyard. That's actually really nice. Like, stuff like that. It does, it's a nice answer to a lot of the adventure-based removal in the format, essentially, is what I'm saying. But just the fact that it has the death trigger that when it dies you learn, which then allows you to tutor or rummage. Very nice. This is one of the better learn spells that we see that are high cost, but that's because you're getting a good creature out of it, essentially. I'll be optimistic and give this a B+. This card is really, really good. Okay, next up, Frost Trickster. 2 and a blue for a 2/2 with flying, and when it enters the battlefield, tap target creature an opponent controls. That creature doesn't untap during its control's next tap step. Okay, first of all, who gave Frostlings flying? First of all. Second of all, this card's really good. For limited, it's a very good limited card. A 3-mana 2/2 flyer, that's fine. And the fact that it has the Frostlings ability of freezing an opponent's creature, that's really, really nice. You're going to keep your eye on this card for limited. It's not like a bomb, but it's pretty close to being just a good creature you want to put in your deck designs in general. So, in limited, it's very high. Yeah, MC Potter, this card is just really good for limited. In constructed, if you have like flicker-based synergies and strategies, you might give it a shot. But mostly this is just a limited all-star card, so keep an eye on it. Pretty good. I'll give it like a pretty high C+, because in limited, this card is going to be really, really good. In other formats, I mean, it's a bird, it's a wizard. Maybe you have like ETB shenanigans, which is... And yeah, the fact that it is a bird wizard is pretty cool, I'm not going to lie. So, yeah, we'll give it a high C+. It's a pretty good card. Next up, one of the weirder cards they showed off that had this mastery cycle. Ingenious Mastery. It's in 2 and blue. Okay. But you may be able to just only play free mana for this effect. So what happens if you do? Well, if you only pay free mana, you draw free cards. For sorcery speed? Cool! But if you do, then an opponent creates 2 treasure tokens, and they scry 2. If that cost wasn't paid, you draw its cards. So, okay, let's first look at this like in a sense that you're only going to do this like if you don't want to do the 2 and a free effect. So, for 4 mana, you draw a card. That's not great. That is not great whatsoever. Paying 4 mana at sorcery speed just to draw a singular card is pretty bad. Now, yes, the fact that later down the line this gets better because then it's like 5 mana, draw 2 cards, 6 mana, draw 3, which at basics, 6 mana, draw 3. We've seen that in the format. It's not a bad card in general. And then the mana sink later down the line, you do get better at this and such. So then we have to look at it from the aspect that, would you rather than pay 2 and a free to cast this, and then draw free cards, because free mana drawing free is good, but giving your opponent 2 treasure tokens and then scrying 2, that's a cost. That is a really, really significant cost. Like, on one hand, this is weird, because essentially what you're doing here is you're giving your opponent semi-ramp, and then you're giving them the ability to scry, which is, I guess, not as bad as, like, in some spells, like making your opponent draw cards and such, and it's only temporary ramp. It's not, like, permanent ramp unless they're playing that dragon that makes their artifacts mana rocks, essentially. I guess. Okay, maybe it's not as bad on the free mana than I think it is. Of course, in Commander, this is going to be an awesome card because the politic natures of it is be like, hey, I want to draw free cards. You want to get some mana and as well be able to scry? Here, cool. Have some mana and such. It's one of those where in Standard, I am not sure if this, especially if this being at sorcery speed, if I would rather do that because remember, we're still in the format where there's like finisher spells, like stuff like Embercleave, the ultimatums. So, like, on turn free, essentially being like, hey, opponent, I'm going to draw free cards, and essentially give you the mana to be able to cast your ultimatum, or just, like, cast your 5-drop and such. Just, I'm really cautious about this card. Like, the reason why it wasn't as bad as the draw free cards is because the factor is, like I stated before, in control decks, you can accommodate for the card draw that your opponent's going to get from it. This, on the other hand, this is essentially just saying, hey, opponent, I'm going to fix your mana and fix your deck so that you essentially could cast a potential spell. Yes, you could potentially answer what the opponent is with your drawing free cards, which is nice. But the thing is, they still get the tempo of the spell that they can cast, and then if you don't answer it, they could draw, like, their bomb. They could draw their finisher, essentially. So, I don't like this card. I'm not gonna lie. Like, I only like this in EDH because the politic implications of the card is nice. But there is still the factor that if you need to, you can just only cast it for free, but then later down the line, it can incrementally draw a lot of cards. I can't underrate that, so I'm gonna give it a C minus, and that's being optimistic. That's me being my optimistic self. Like, I am so tempted to give this a D minus. I'm not gonna lie. Like, I kind of want to give this like a D minus or a F even, because I feel like, but I do think this is a card that's good for EDH. I do think there's some implications for it in Standard if as long as the meta accommodates for it. But be very, very cautious when playing this card. I'm just going to say that right off the bat. Next up, the Whoo Boy Mythic card of the set. And it's an NDFC card. Jadzi, Oracle of Arcaveos. I think it's how you pronounce that plane. 8 mana for a 5/5. So this card's better to do some stuff, and it does. So you discard a card. You can return this card to your hand, so it's semi-protection. But it has Magecraft. And what is its Magecraft effect? Well, whenever you cast or copy an instant sorcery spell, reveal the top card of your library. If it's a non-land card, you may cast it by paying 1 generic mana rather than paying its mana cost. And if it's a land card, you just put it onto the battlefield. You don't put it on the battlefield tap, you just put it onto the battlefield. We're going to be talking about this side, but we also have the backside of this card, which is Journey to the Oracle. 2 and 2 green for sorcery. You may put any number of land cards from your hand onto the battlefield. Not tapped. Keep that in mind. Then, if you control 8 or more lands, you may discard a card. If you do, return Journey to the Oracle to its owner's hand, aka the spell. The reason why they have that effect there is just so that, let's say you ramp into the 8 mana, but you only have this as your only instance of the front side, you can return the front side back so you can cast it on the following turn. So let's actually, I'm going to first start with the back side because I think it's the less impressive part of the sides of the card. A lot of people have been saying this is like 4 mana ramp, and it kind of is and it kind of isn't. Like, majority of ramp in the formats, you rather have 2 mana ramp to 3 mana ramp. 4 mana, it's ramp if you have land cards in your hand, but that's a catch-22. You need to have land cards in your hand for this to be semi-good ramp. And the question is, are you going to keep like a land-flooded hand to just inevitably then play Journey into the Oracle? Like, you kind of have to brew around this where like you play like turn 3, you play like a massive draw spell, which then hopefully gets you a lot of land cards, and then on turn 4, cast this spell. I feel like there's just a lot of knobs and widgets, so to speak, for you to be able to cast this portion consistently. That being said, the factor is this is still technically a 4 mana that gets reduced by every land you play untapped, so you do get the quote-unquote mana rebate from it. That is not an ability to underestimate, especially since we have landfall in the meta, so you gotta keep that in mind. And also the ability to essentially return this spell back to your hand is very nice, so that you can cast the one side we are going to talk about, which is Jadzi. And I'm just going to say it. Jadzi is absolutely freaking insane. Like, that is an insane card. It's... Okay, 8 mana is a lot, don't get me wrong. 8 mana is a crap ton of mana. But here's the thing. We have a ton of ways to cheap Jadzi out. Like, let's think about this for a minute. Like, we have, like, Transmogrify. We have cheap reanimation spells. We have a whole ton of ways. We can even Tybalt's Trickery into this. And just, we have so many ways and avenues to be able to, quote-unquote, cheap this in for a lot earlier than it should in general. And when you do, just the fact that you can, like, say, cast an opt or cast one of your cheap spells and such, and then just, use it as a ramp spell to play lands, or Like, let's say you reveal an ultimatum on top and then pay 1 mana for an ultimatum. And that's not even including the fact that if you have any spell reduction spells, which there's a few in the format, like, let's imagine like the Magical Christmas Land scenario where you can like say, for example, let's say you have Jazzy and you have like Burgie on the battlefield and maybe like a second copy of Burgie through like Spark Double or something like that. You can do a theoretical thing here where if you have like a, with the exception of those permanents, like a heavy instant and sorcery spell deck, you could have a semi-storm engine with this, because what you do is you essentially cast your instant sorcery spell. It triggers like one of the Burgies and two of the Burgies to get the 2 red mana and such. You get the mana. You then flip this. You flip like a powerful instant sorcery spell. Then you sink one of the Burgie mana into it. Repeat this again and again. And the fact that even if you only have one Burgie, that you could theoretically storm off with this, it's just... it is freaking insane. Like... it's insane. This card is an absolutely insane card. If you cheap it out. Now let's talk about the applications of ramping into this, which, to be fair, we do have a lot of ramp in the format. We have our cultivates, we have a lot of ramp spells. You could theoretically ramp this into turn 8 and such. Do I think that's going to be an archetype in Standard? Well, Genesis Ultimatum is an archetype in Standard at the moment, so that's a big... I would say it's a big maybe, because... this effect to be able to, say, cast an Ugin for 1 mana is nothing to underestimate. Or cast a Genesis Ultimatum for 1. That being said, I do think this is kind of one of those tricky cards because 8 mana is a lot. We are in a very aggressive meta at the moment, so you could just easily ramp, and then just die before you cast a spell and do the Magecraft abilities. So that's something to keep in mind. But this card is insane. Like, this is a card. Because we have ways to cheap the card out in formats, in a variety of formats. And if you can cheap this card out and keep it alive for a turn, you can do some very, 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 very stupid shenanigans with this card. Like, there's some dumb stuff you can do with this card. I cannot stress this enough. This card can do some very dumb things. So yeah, this is like an A++ card. If a deck can brew around it, it's going to be the all-star card of that deck. I'm just gonna say that. Oh, that card's scary. Next up, Kelpie Guide. 2 and a blue for a creature beast. It has tap, untap another target permanent you control, or tap it, tap target permanent. Activate only if you control 8 or more lands. Okay. Pretty decent card, actually. A free mana 2/2 that essentially allows you to semi-ramp by untapping a specific permanent, or give a permanent semi-vigilance. That's really nice. And then later down the game, if you ramp enough to the 8 lands, that then you could use this as a tapper. Not bad. I'd say this is a really good limited card. I see that it might have some fringe application in Standard, since we do have some really good activated ability cards that we're going to be talking about in a minute. That just being able to untap like one of your activated ability creatures, or being able to untap a land, which then allows you to maybe hold up counter magic, or maybe activate an ability on a land and such. That's nothing to underestimate. So this one is an average, I'd say it's a C card. This card is C. This card is pretty decent. It's good in the right decks. Not bad. Not bad whatsoever. Next up, Mentor's Guidance. 2 and a blue for a sorcery that has, whenever you cast a spell, copy it if you control a planeswalker, cleric, druid, shaman, or wizard. Okay, now, one thing to keep in mind, you can only have this copy one time. This is not a, oh, if you have multiple of these permanents, it's going to duplicate every time you have any of those permanents. No. It's just saying, hey, if you have any of the following things, you can duplicate this once. Okay? Okay. But what does it do when you cast it? Well, you scry 1 and you draw a card. Pretty good card. This one is a really good card, actually. Just, yeah, free mana for scrying 1 and drawing a card is not great, but if you meet the requirements of this card meeting, which is pretty easy since we have powerful clerics in the format, powerful druids, like we do have good wizards, we have good warlocks that we're getting in the set, you can meet the condition of being able to copy the spell relatively easy with this card. So free mana to essentially activate this ability twice, which essentially mounts to scrying 2 and drawing 2 cards from your deck. For free mana at sorcery speed's not bad. That's actually pretty good. So, yeah. And also, we have Magecraft in the format, so this is a way to activate Magecraft 2 times, which is nice. And we have wizards and shamans and variety of creatures that have Magecraft. Hint, hint, wink, wink, nod, nod. So yeah, I like Mentor's Guidance a lot, enough to like give it a B minus. I think this card, if Magecraft decks are going to be a thing, they might consider this card because it's a cheap activator of Magecraft, and just being able to get 2 cheap Magecraft triggers off this spell, very, very nice. Next up, another lesson, which is freaking hilarious. Peculiar Transformation. 1 and a blue for a lesson. Until end of turn, target non-land permanent. Keep in mind it's a permanent. Loses all abilities and becomes your choice of a blue flawed creature with base power and toughness 1-1 or a blue octopus creature with base power and toughness 4-4. The thing that kills this card is the flavor text. For sun's sake, I just wanted a crab. Okay, that is amazing flavor there. That is a funny card in general. As for the card in general, though, from a design perspective, a tutorable ability to either make an opponent's permanent not that great for a turn, or just be able to make one of your permanents big enough to actually go on to the aggressive. That's a very nice ability on an uncommon lesson. Also, there's some cute tricks you could do with this where, let's say, for example, you're playing like a Gritz's Sack deck, for example. I'm just putting that as an example. Or maybe you have like a Witch's Oven and such. Like, let's say, for example, you play Mercurial Transformation and then you claim the Firstborn it because I believe, well, I don't know if it loses its mana cost. If it loses its mana cost, you can do that effect. Let's see. Target loses all abilities and become... Okay, it doesn't affect the mana cost, but let's say you do like an Act of Treason-like effect to be able to steal it as a creature. Like, let's say you change a Planeswalker into a frog. You steal the frog temporary, and then you sack it with the Witch's Oven, which is the best way to then remove an opponent's like Planeswalker and such. Or even any non-land permanents, so maybe like a problematic enchantment and such. There's also the fact that like you could like maybe play this on turn 6, like you turn 2 this, and then take like their most problematic like artifact, planeswalker, enchantment, and such, and then you Storm's Wrath the board as a board wipe, so then you destroy the non-land permanent that is problematic and such, as well as the creatures with the board wipe. That's really, really good. So, I think there's some fringe play. Just the fact that this is a lesson you can tutor out of your sideboard, very nice. The card's funny. The card actually has some fringe applications in standard and such, so keep an eye on it. I'm optimistic enough to give it like a C+. This card's actually pretty good. Especially if you put in the deck where you are going to take advantage that the fact that the permanent's going to become either a frog or a giant octopus. But unfortunately, not a crab. Very sad. That student's really crabby at the moment. And yes, I have been waiting all this time to make that stupid pun. Next up, Multiple Choice. Fascinating spell. Also very on flavor. It is X and a blue for sorcery. If X is a 1, scry 1, then draw a card. So 2 mana, scry 1, draw a card. Perfectly fine. If X is 2, you may choose a player. That player must then return a creature they control to its owner's hand, aka Unsummoned Skull will like this effect. If X is free, create a 4/4 blue and red elemental creature token. Or if X is 4 or more, I don't know why you would do it more unless you're trying to make a really big token with Shark Typhoon. It's probably the exception to this, but if you decide to spend 4 or more on this, you do all of the above. So then you scry 1, draw a card, then choose the player, and then create the token. This card is really good. Just, here's the thing. 2 mana, scry 1, draw a card, very nice. The fact is, I guess the basic way to not like go rambling on about this card, the versatility of this card is its main strength. The fact that you can play this early to mid game to either late game to then get all the effects, very nice. And all the effects on the card on the choices that you get are nice within the realms of when you have the mana range of playing these spells. Like early game, you don't mind scrying one and drawing a card. Unlike when you get free mana, you do not mind of being able to do a free mana bounce effect, especially just at sorcery speed if you have like an aggressive early game creature you want to attack in with. And then Etz is free, a 4 mana 4/4, perfectly fine. Not amazing since it doesn't have any additional abilities, but it's a creature token, so maybe you're playing in like a token deck. And then later down the line, you can just then make Etz 4 and do all of that for 5 mana is absurd. So, overall, I'm going to give this a B+. This card is a pretty good card, but you need to be in a deck where you want to either be at the moment where you don't mind choosing either one of these effects. You shouldn't always presume that you're going to make Etz equals 4. I think that's going to be the one weakness when people are going to play this card. They're going to presume best case mentality and be like, oh, I'm going to be able to get to the point in the game where I can cast this for 4 consistently. I don't think so, especially if aggro mid-range decks become a thing, or they already are a thing. So I think you want to put this in a deck where you don't mind choosing any of the 1, 2, or 3 choices, and it's consistent within your deck design. Next up, Pop Quiz, everybody. 2 and a blue for an instant. Draw a card and learn. Pretty good card. This is a really good card. Just being able to dig one card deep into your deck and then learn, which either means you rummage the card that you don't want to, like, let's say you draw the land and you would rather just rummage, you could just rummage the land and then try to dig deeper into your deck. But also the fact that with learn, you can just tutor out a specific card. That's very nice. This at instant speed is very nice. So, like, it's not an amazing card. The problem is it's still a high-cost learn spell. And as stated before, I really like my learn spells if they're high cost to have, like, a significant oomph to it. And just drawing one card and then doing the tutoring effect, I don't think that's big enough of an oomph, if that makes sense, or a big enough effect. The fact that it is instant speed does make this card better. Don't get me wrong. But I think there are better learn spells, so I'm gonna give it a C-. I think some people will still play this because it is still kind of like, especially if you're playing like a graveyard-oriented deck design, it is more or less essentially just draw 2 cards more or less for free mana, which is pretty good at instant speed. But there's some better learn spells in the format. Let me just put it like that. And permanents that learn as well. Next up, Reject. 1 and a blue for an instant. Counter target creature or planeswalker spell unless its control pays free mana. If that spell is countered this way, exile it instead of putting it into its owner's graveyard. I like this card a lot. Like, if you're playing a control deck, this is actually a pretty decent early game mana leak effect. Like, there's a lot of powerful creature cards in the format. There's also a lot of powerful, planeswalkers that we've been seeing so far and that are in standard. Like, we're not in a planeswalker format yet, but you always have to keep in mind that there is sometimes where planeswalker formats can be a thing. So just being able to have this spell either in your sideboard or even in your main board, especially if your meta is mostly consistently creature-oriented, to just be like, mana leak the creature and then it exiles itself, which is perfect, especially since we have a lot of graveyard shenanigans in the format at the moment. So, Reject is not a reject to me. It's like a... I'll give it like a B-. This card's actually pretty good in the right decks. Like, yeah, you're going to be playing in the control decks, but the fact that it exiles when you counter it, very, very nice. And of course, with mana leak effects, there is a disclosure that this card does get bad later down the line, but hopefully you didn't essentially get cards that actually help affect that. Hey, Adam, how you holding up? Hey, Adam. Next up, Resculpt. 1 and a blue for a instant. Exile target artifact or creature. Its controller creates a 4/4 blue and red elemental creature token. Okay, so 2 mana to essentially make a 4/4, that's nothing to really underestimate, I will say. This one's weird, because people have been really comparing this to, Insult Artifact. I don't think it's an insult artifact, because the problem is you do have to exile your permanent and such to get this effect. A 4/4 token is nice on turn 2, but yet again, we are in a format where there's a lot of really good removal, especially good ways to remove tokens, so I think a majority of the time this is mostly going to be used as a removal spell, which as a removal spell it's surprisingly decent, because like on tempo, just being able to destroy like a Great Hinge or an Embercleave and being like, no, you're not going to win the game this turn with an Embercleave. That Embercleave is just going to become a 4/4 that's going to be board wipe next turn. That's something to keep in mind. Yet again, there is better removal in the format. You could theoretically put this in an aggro deck. I would say be cautious though, especially since there's a lot of good token removal in the format. So be cautious with this card. It's cautious enough that I'm just going to give it like a C minus. I think it's not bad, but I don't think it's going to be as good as people take for granted. And no, it's not an Ensoul artifact. It's not even close. Next up, Serpentine Curve. I see the math pun there. It's a sorcery spell. Create a 0/0 green and blue fractal creature token. Put X +1/+1 counters on it, where X is 1 plus the total number of instant sorcery cards you own in exile or in your graveyard. This is more for limited. It's hard because it's not even that great of a limited card. Well, maybe. I'm not as much as I love the math pun with this card. I don't think the card's amazing. I mean, in theory, we are going into a Spell Slinger limited set where we're getting a lot more incentive to cast instant sorcery spells. So in theory, this is a incrementally get bigger, quote unquote, like creature, so to speak. So maybe later down the line, this could be a 4-mana create a 4/4, 5/5, 6/6, and such. But even in general, even in heavy Spell Slinger limited formats, you are still just at most putting like 5 to 8 instant sorcery spells within your deck design, so I don't know. Like, I feel like in limited, it's going to be just a fine curve filler card, but it's not going to be amazing. In constructed, there's some cute shenanigans you can do with this in Spell Slinger decks. Like if you're playing like a heavy instant sorcery spell deck design, you then, like, let's say you play Terror of the Peaks within your deck design, you have Terror of the Peaks, and then you play like Serpentine Curve, make a big creature, and then essentially just be able to deal significant damage to either your opponent or to any target. Like, stuff like that. But the problem is, 4 mana to just create a semi-decent sized token, unless you have, like, a Terror Peats out. Like I said before, there's a lot of good token removal in the format, so I think I just gotta give this a D, because this card's not bad, but it's a very fringe card. Like, it's not like going to be amazing in the formats you play it. You mostly just play it as curve filler. That's really the only reason you're playing the card. That, or you're playing it for the math pun, which honestly I wouldn't blame you if you play it for the math pun. Okay, next up, Snow Day. Okay, cute flavor here. 6 mana for an instant, so that's a lot, but let's read what the card does. It has tap up to 2 target creatures. Those creatures don't untap during their control's next untap step, and it has draw 2 cards, then discard a card. So technically, put in perspective, we usually spend free mana to draw 2 cards, and we usually spend free mana to do this effect where we freeze 2 creatures at instant speed. That's very, very nice for a 6 mana spell, so we are paying our mana's worth to get those effects. I think mostly, though, this is mostly for limited. There is some fringe standard applications where, let's say, for example, you're playing like a Shark Typhoon control deck. This is like a cheap way to get a 6-cost spell, get your card draw, and then essentially tap down some Problematic Friars so that your Sharks can essentially tack in, so to speak. But there is also just better 6-cost spells in the format, so I think this is mostly going to see its play in limited and control-based decks that do want this effect, because being able to draw 2 cards and then loot, essentially, discard a card you don't need at the moment, and then be able to freeze 2 problematic creatures, that's very nice. So I'm going to give it like a C minus. This card's decent, but it's not like amazing. Next up, a card that's mostly going to see its play in EDH. Solve the Equation. 2 and a blue for sorcery. Search your library for an instant and sorcery card. Reveal it. And then put it into your hand and then shuffle your library. Okay, in EDH, this card is really good. Like, in EDH, tutor effects are always appreciated in the format. And the fact that this can tutor for any powerful instant sorcery spell within your deck design, that is really, really good. you yes, we do prefer the mana tutors. We prefer 1-2 mana tutors, but we don't mind 3 mana tutors. And this is a 3 mana tutor. Get like your most powerful spell you need at the moment. Yes, it does hurt that it's sorcery speed, but you don't really mind if you're tutoring for like your bomb spell that you don't mind casting next turn. Tutors, never underestimate them in EDH. In constructed, like in standard and such, I don't know. This is one of those where we are in a format where Grim tutors occurred and Idyllic tutors occurred, and those cards have not been seen much play per se, but you don't really lose life, and if you are just tutoring for a very specific instant sorcery, and we do have powerful instant sorceries in the format, like, I can see some people playing this like in Genesis Ultimatum, just being able to tutor their ultimatum on turn 6 and then turn 7 be able to cast it. That's really the fringe application where I kind of will see, I think this card will see play in standard. And for limited, it's probably too slow, but yet again, it is a spell slinger set. We have been seeing a lot of powerful instant sorcery spells, so you kind of have to keep it in the back of your head kind of scenario. So, I'm going to give it like a C. It's a good card, but I think mostly it's going to shine in Commander. This is like a great budget Commander card, essentially. Never underestimate the power of a good tutor. Next up, Soothsayer Adept. 1 in a blue for a 1 free, and has 1 in a blue, draw a card, and discard a card. You only play this in limited. Like, yes, it's a merfolk. You could play this in merfolk, but there's better merfolk. You only play this in limited for the mana sink ability to loot. That's really all you're going to be doing with this card. You're just going to prefer doing the looting aspect of it. I really don't think this is going to see any Eternal format plays or any standard play and such, like maybe in budget decks, maybe. But even then, in those formats, they're just better looters in general, so this is like a... If we're playing limited, it's like an average D-. It's a D-. But in constructed formats, it's like it's kind of like an F. It's an F at the set. You're only going to be playing this in limited. Next up, Symmetry Sage. 1 mana for a 0/2 flyer. Okay. But it has Magecraft. Whenever you cast or copy an instant sorcery spell, target creature you control has base power 2 until end of turn. Okay, let's get this out of the way. Yes, technically speaking, can be a 1 mana 2/2 flyer. 1 mana 2/2 flyers have been relatively powerful, especially in tempo decks. That being said, you have to cast an instant sorcery spell to make this a 2/2 flyer. And I just don't know. This is one of those cards where, I mean, there is combat tricks. There is enchantments and auras to buff up the power on this, which then, once you did be able to cast an instant sorcery, this can attack for a lot more significance, like power. Like, let's say you put a +1/+1 boost, like aura on it, like for example, and then you trigger the effect, giving it base power 2. So then it taps in like as a free fly and such. There's stuff like that. There's also mutate. Well, no, you can't even mutate because this is not a non-human creature, so that's out of the bin. So I'm probably going to regret this score because if a tempo flying deck exists, they might try this card. But I'm not really optimistic of this in constructed. I'm really not. Like, I'm so much not that I'm kind of giving this a D-, and that's being optimistic. It's just 0/2 flyer is not amazing. Like, okay, the only fringe circumstances where I can see this card seeing play is if it's a tech against rogues. Because, yes, it's a semi-reach creature with being able to have flying, and you can block some of the early game flying rogues. Like, you can block that 1/1 that essentially when it attacks in, your opponent mills a card. Like, that's the really fringe circumstances where I could see this card seeing play. Besides that, though, I just don't see it. I really don't see it. I am willing to be proven wrong, but I just don't see it, and who knows? Maybe this will be the card that I'm going to be like, the top card I was wrong about, but I highly doubt it. Next up, Teaching of the Archaics. 2 and a blue for a sorcery lesson that's a rare, and it has this effect. If an opponent has more cards in hand than you draw 2 cards, no matter what. But draw 3 cards instead if an opponent has at least 4 more cards in hand than you. This card is interesting because I think this is mostly a card that's only going to see play in your sideboard to tutor out as a lesson, so to speak, because the problem is with this card, it's very, very conditional draw. Like, you have to make sure your opponent has more that cards than you to at least on basis be able to draw 2 cards. Which is a great comeback mechanism in a sense, which I'm not going to undeny that. But it is at sorcery speed, you are spending a significant amount of mana on it, and then if you're in the circumstances where your opponent has at least 4 more cards in your hand than you have cards in your hand, being able to draw 3 more cards is nice, but I think you're mostly going to draw 2 cards from this. Like, I think this card is decent. Like, it's decent enough to be like a D plus to a C minus. But I think it's only going to be a sideboard card that you're only going to be tutoring out when you're in the circumstances where you need the card draw. And even then, I don't know if you're mostly wanting to tutor out card draw. I think you're mostly wanting to tutor out answers. But I do think the power of this card is the fact that you can tutor it out. So I'll be optimistic and give it like a C minus. Conditional card draw is tricky to play, but if you could just you can tutor out this conditional card draw, it makes the card decent. Next up, Tempted by the Auric. 1 in free blue, that's a lot of blue, for a sorcery spell. It has for each opponent, gain control of up to 1 target creature or planeswalker that player controls with mana value 3 or less. Okay, let's just get this out of the way. Pretty much Game Nights had spoiled this card, and there's a reason why Game Nights spoiled this, because this is a really, really absurd commander card. Like, this is ridiculously absurd. Because the thing is, a majority of powerful planeswalkers in the format in general, we do have some high-cost planeswalkers, but a majority of the very good ones are usually free mana or less and such. We've been getting a lot of better ones that are free mana or less recently, like War of the Spark provided a ton of them, essentially. And a lot of them had become like commander staple cards, like the free cost Vivian, Narset, and the more CEDH variations. I could go on. Even you could see the free cost Tybalt and like burn decks in general. So being able to just spend 4 mana, steal your opponent's planeswalkers of that, very nice. And then the factor is you also have the choice of being able to steer like your opponent's creatures up to even their commander if it's a cheap commander. That's very, very nice. So in commander, this card is going to be a balmy card. In standard, in limited, it's not bad. A mind control for 4 mana, even with the free blue, is not bad. But you have to be in a deck that's primary blue if you want to play this, because mostly I think for this effect, you want to play this automatically on turn 4. You do not want to play this later down the line, because later down the line, your opponents will play in higher cost permanent creatures and such, so then it makes this a dead mind control in your hand. Still, that being said, being able to steal like a Bone Crusher Giant or Lovestruck Beast, not bad. Being able to even steal like a Innkeeper and such is not bad either. Like, there is potential for this card in Standard. I'm not going to deny that. There's potential, but free blue on it does hurt this card a lot. And that's even talking about a format that we have the World Tree in, so I'm going to be optimistic and give this like a C+, because I think the card is good. But I think it's mostly going to be a main EDH stay card, because in EDH, especially in the right metas, this card can be a backbreaker. Next up, a card that Oh, I am so excited this card exists. Test of Talents. 1 in a blue for an instant. Counter target instant or sorcery spell. Search its control's graveyard, library, and hand for any number of cards with the same name as that spell and exile them. That player shuffles that, then draws a card for each card exiled from their hands as this way. This card is so good. Okay, why do I love this card? I love this card because this is a card that is the best way to answer both. It's a really good, like, silver bullet to a lot of spells in the format. Like, let's say you're going against a control deck. Like, let's say you're going against rogues. You go against rogues. Let's say you try to cheapen, like, a 2-cost permanent, and then they try to drown on lock because they always have the drown on the lock. You then just, since they spend drown on the lock meta, you just test the talents, take all the drown of the locks out of their library. You don't have to deal with that spell anymore. There's a lot of high, powerful instant sorcery spells. Then the factor is you can also use this to take out removal spells. Like, let's say your opponent tries a Heartless Act, one of the more popular removals in the format. Test the talents. Take out all the Heartless Acts. Take out all the Extinction events. Take out all of the popular spells in the format and just don't have to deal with them. There's even sometimes where this could be backbreaking to your opponent because let's say you counter like a Genesis or an Emergent Ultimatum, and then they lose every copy of the ultimatums, which is their primary victory condition. That is really, really good. Yes, this is a very fringe counterspell. You can only counter an instant sorcery spell. But considering that we're in a format that has very, very powerful instant sorcery spells that you do not mind to counter with tests of the talents, this card is good. Also, one thing to keep in mind. You can try to counter an uncounterable spell. Yes, you're not going to counter the spell, but if I'm recalling my ruling correctly, you still be able to search the library, the hand, and such to remove all instances of the spell. So just being able to use this as just to remove a very annoying uncounterable spell from your opponent's library and such, that's really good. So yeah, I like this card. This is like a A+ card. No, okay, that's being too optimistic. I'm gonna give it an A- because this card is very powerful in the right decks. I could see rogues playing it, which is a little annoying, but I could also see this as a good answer to a lot of powerful instant and sorcery spells that we have in the format. It's going to make people have to alter their deck brews, which is nice. They can't be too reliant on very powerful instant sorcery spells. Also, one other mental note to actually for people, no, this doesn't counter adventure spells. Like, yes, it does, but you don't get the secondary effect of it since technically it's a creature spell. You can't search the opponent's library for the instant portion of the adventure spell since it's technically the creature part of the card. So, you gotta keep that in mind. But for all the other popular instant and sorcery spells in the format, this is just a good answer to it. So, this is an A- card. This card is just really good. Next up, we have an NDFC card, which is Torrent Sculptor, as well as Flame Thrower Sonata. So let's first talk about the front card. 4 mana 2/2 with Ward 2. For those who don't know what Ward means, it essentially says that if this... Well, it actually says here, whenever this creature becomes the target of a spell or an ability an opponent controls, counter it unless the opponent plays 2 mana, so this is like semi-hexproof, essentially. But it has, when this enters the battlefield, exile an instant or sorcery card from your graveyard, put a number of +1/+1 counters on Torrent Sculptor equal to half that card's mana value rounded up. So, best case example, let's say you play this and you exile like an ultimatum. Half rounded up would be 4. So you're going to put like 4 counters on this, and this could be a 4 mana sit-sits with semi-hexproof. That's pretty good. You could also technically, like, let's say, exile a 2-cost spell, you put 1 counter on it, but then if you exile a 3-cost spell, you put 2 counters on it, 4 is 2, etc., etc., etc. Like, it's a pretty decent card. Like, the problem is it doesn't have any evasion, but being able to put the counters on it, we do have cards that do interact with counters to give creatures abilities with counters on it, so... Like that weird, like, free cost Pride Mulking Cat, which makes creatures with counters on it have trample, like stuff like that, essentially. So, in that realm of circumstances, you might try a card for that case. But honestly, I think this is just a card that you will have as a option you can play, but I think a majority of people are going to be playing it for the Flamethrower Sonata. One in a red for a sorcery, it has discard a card and then draw a card. When you discard an instant sorcery card this way, this spell deals damage equal to the card's mana value to target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls. And this is a very, very powerful sorcery. Like, yes, it's sorcery speed, which is not that amazing, but being able to essentially discard a card and draw a card, very nice. If you don't mind discarding the instant sorcery spell, this can remove some of the most problematic creatures in the format. Like, all you have to do is just, like, discard a 5-cost spell to destroy a destroy a Lovestruck Beast. Granted, that then has to ask us the questions of if we're going to play this in a deck where you're going to have high-cost instant sorcery spells. I think that is going to be the case, especially if you're playing it to play also the front portion of the card, because then this card gets a lot better, because then you exile the spell from the graveyard and then make this bigger. That's very nice. As well as just the Flamethrower Sonata could even just remove small creatures. Like, you can just remove like a 2-2 by just essentially exiling a 2-cost spell. Or, not exiling, but discarding a 2-cost spell and such. And worst case scenario, if you don't use the removal portion of this, you can just use this as a rummage. 2 mana to rummage is not great, but it's not bad. But the fact that it's a rummage that can inevitably become a burn spell, we've seen stuff like Narset have this ability, like the Jeskai Narset being very, very, very good. So, I think the fact that a majority of people are going to be playing it for the Sonata, especially in Spellslinger decks, this part is really good. Which then makes the front side just very complementary to be used as a semi-mid-range to maybe even a finisher in some control matchups. So, I'll be optimistic and give this a B. This is a pretty good card. A majority of the time, you're going to be using it for the removal portion. But the fact that you do have this for late game to have as a creature to be able to use as a semi-finisher, very, very, very nice. Next up, we get to the Prismari Deans, which in this case is Uvida, Dean of Perfection, as well as Naseri, Dean of Expression. Let's first talk about Uvida. I am going to butcher the pronunciation. I apologize in advance. But Dean of Perfection. It is a wizard, a Jin wizard, that's a 2-2, that has tap, and you may exile an instant sorcery card from your hand and put free hone counters on it. It gains, at the beginning of your upkeep, if this card is exiled, remove a hone counter from it. And when the last hone counter is removed, you may cast it, and then the spell will cost 4 less to cast. Okay, so essentially what this is basically saying is, you play this, you hope it doesn't get Bone Crusher Giant or removed, then you can tap, and then let's say put a Aurun's Epiphany in it with a home counter on it in exile. So then you wait your free turns, and then you essentially free turns, essentially wait for that to happen. Then the last home counter comes off, and then you can cast Aurun's Epiphany for 3 mana. That seems pretty good. I think this is mostly going to be a good commander card for the front side, because I do think that ability is really nice and scary. Especially since we have powerful instant sorcery spells in the commander format. Being able to suspend it, essentially, because this is what it is. It's essentially a balance suspend, more or less. Being able to have the balance suspend on it is very nice. Also, one really, really cute thing that you can do with this card. You can technically play this in a deck with... Oh, no, wait. Bad idea. The cutest thing I was going to say is technically... Well, actually, no. Let's say your opponent's playing Vorinclex. If your opponent's playing Vorinclex, then you could have this on the battlefield and only have to put, like, 1 home counter on it, which is actually really nice, especially for some powerful instant sorcery spells that maybe could... But, that's really fringe. That's a really, really fringe case. But I guess there are ways to remove counters and such, so if you are in a format that has easy ways to remove specific type of counters, keep that in mind, I guess, but be very careful on it. But nevertheless, I do think this card is more of an EDH card, but it does have circumstances where against some control matchups, if you need to just, like, semi-protect like your extra turn spell or your late game finisher spell that you don't want to get like hand disrupted. It's pretty decent. But I think a majority of people are going to be playing the card for Nasiri, Dean of Expression. 5 mana for a 4/4 Elfric Shaman. It has, at the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top card of each opponent's library. So it's Stolen Strategy, essentially. Until in a turn, you may cast that spell from among those exile cards, and you may spend mana as though it's with mana of any color to cast it. So okay, so it's a lot more balanced Stolen Strategy, essentially. And then whenever you cast a spell from exile, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. Okay, I think this is mostly going to be the reason why you're playing this card in Standard, if you're going to be playing it in Standard, because a 5 mana 4/4 is decent, but the factor is that it has the ability that at the beginning of your upkeep, you semi-mill your opponent, you get card advantage. It's the similar card advantage like you get with Tibble, but you are only affected on just essentially until in a turn you can only cast the spells, but you still exiling spells from your opponents, so that's very nice. And then the fact is, when you cast the spells from exile, and this could be any spell from exile, this could be stuff like adventure spells, this could be stuff like foretelled spells and such, being able to put a counter on it and make it bigger, 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 bigger. Very, very good. This is a very, very good back portion of the card. And also, it does synergize with the front portion, since you are casting the Hone spell from exile, so it gets bigger. So, I think a majority of people are going to be playing it for the backside, but the front side is a nice complementary component of the card, so overall, I'm not going to go shoot this over the moon. I think this is more still like a B- card, but it's still a very fun commander card. I think this is mostly going to see its play in commander, especially in spell Slender decks, whether in the 99 or as your primary commander. And in Constructed, it's definitely cute, especially if you can protect this creature and such. You can do some really cute shenanigans. So next up, the Vortex Runner. 2 and a blue for a human wizard. As long as you control 8 or more lands, Vortex Runner gets +1 and can't be blocked. Okay, this is more a limited card, but this is one of those obnoxious limited cards, because, for those who don't know, usually some really, really good limited cards are cards that are essentially evasive. And this is probably some of the best version of evasive, because your opponent cannot block this creature whatsoever. So, technically a free mana 2/3 is decent, but then later down the line, if you are at 8 lands, which then are at the point where maybe you're trying to finish off your opponent, being able to make this a free unblockable is very, very, very good. In Standard, probably not, since it's prone to a lot of removal in the format. And the problem is, it's just one of those cards where you have to be at 8 lands to be a very exciting card. There's a lot of better free drops in the format, let me just put it like that. But in Limited, this is going to be a pretty sneakily good card. You're going to be a little bit obnoxious on it, especially since it's a common, so in Limited, it's like a B- to a C+ card. In Constructed, though, it's like a D. It's like a very, very optimistic D. Next up, Waterfall Arius. 3 and a blue for a free 1 with flying and has Ward of 2. So, a 4 mana for a free 1 flyer that's very hard to essentially target unless you're willing to spend the extra 2 mana. Really good card. This is a really, really good limited card. It might even see some fringe standard play in the Flyers decks, essentially, because the Ward ability is very nice. Though, granted, we do have board wipes in the format, so I think it's mostly going to see its play as being a very good common limited card. Maybe some fringe play in budget decks in Standard and such, but I highly doubt it. But still, a free 1 flyer that's really hard to target is nothing to underestimate. Next up. Oh, I forgot to give a grade. Brain fart. As for the grade of the card, I'm going to give it like a... It's like a C+. It's like a good card, but I think there are better cards in the format. Next up, Wormhole Serpent. 4 and a blue for a free 5 Serpent. It has an activate ability of 4 mana to target creature. It can't be blocked this turn. This one is a pretty decent limited card because a 5 mana free 5 is perfectly fine, and the fact that you do have the mana sink ability to make any of your creatures unblockable. Because remember, it says target creature. It's not one of these where it's just this creature cannot be blocked. Any creature, like any really good like finisher creature, can essentially be mana synced to be unblockable, which is very, very, very good for limited. In standard, no. There's just a lot better spells in the format that does this effect. I mean, if you're playing Serpent Tribal, sure. And it is nice that this is an uncommon and limited, so you don't have to worry about this being common and then be very annoyed about this being consistently picked up in draft. So, in like limited, I think it's a pretty good card. In constructed, with maybe the exception of throwing it in your Serpent Tribal EDH deck, probably not. So, in constructed, it's like a average, a C minus, with a little bit more up a C plus to maybe even a B minus range in limited.